Under the deep red hues of an Arkansas dawn, the old valley woke to a sound it had never heard before, steel against earth, engines growling like distant thunder. It was not a storm. It was a line of machines, excavators, bulldozers, and survey trucks tracing the perimeter of a cornfield that had once been planted by hand. At the far edge stood Theodore Hudson, known simply as Ted, silent as the ground he had walked since boyhood. His boots, crusted with decades of toil, pressed into the chilled soil that his grandfather once called sacred. The corn had long been harvested. Only stalk stubble remained, rising like broken ribs from the frozen dirt. In the far distance, mist clung to the hills as if the land itself hesitated to face the coming day. Ted's breath formed small clouds in the crisp morning air, but he did not move. He did not wave or shout or plead. He simply stood and watched, like a man witnessing his own final chapter begin. He had no partner to stand beside him, no neighbors lining up in protest. Most had sold years ago, encouraged by incentives or exhausted by drought and debt. What had once been a patchwork of farms was now a creeping grid of metal, wires, and storage warehouses. Ted alone had remained. Not out of stubbornness or pride, but because this land was more than property, it was his language, his memory, his grief. In the center of the field, near a now dry irrigation trench, stood an old oak tree planted in 1984, the year his son was born. That same boy had once tied a tire swing to its branches and, years later, planted marigolds near its base before leaving for boot camp. The swing had rotted away. The marigolds never returned. His son didn't either. Sergeant Daniel Hudson died in Iraq, far from the valley, far from the tree. Ted never removed the wooden cross his wife had hammered into the ground beneath that oak. He repainted it each spring, pale white with black lettering that had faded under decades of storms. This was the only grave his son had. He never visited the National Cemetery. This was the place that mattered. This was where Daniel's laughter once rang, where his boots last pressed dirt, where his hand had once helped plant cotton rows. There were no visitors anymore. After Daniel's death, his wife's health failed quickly. The insurance hadn't covered enough. Cancer treatments had swallowed their savings, and when she passed, the house grew quiet in a way that no amount of radio or television could mask. Ted stayed. He fixed fences, dug wells, and mended what could be mended. He built small things that no one would see but him, a birdhouse near the porch, a bench near the edge of the north field, a shed repainted every spring even though no one asked him to. And still, the machines came. 2 weeks earlier, he had received a letter, 5 pages long, filled with stamped signatures and legal language. The words were surgical in tone: eminent domain, public interest, development zone. The attached map bore no emotion, only dotted lines and color blocks that dissected his land like an anatomy chart. They called it progress. To Ted, it felt like erasure. He had tried to fight. Hired a lawyer out of Little Rock with what was left of a dwindling account. Attended council meetings where his voice was cut off after 3 minutes. Wrote letters to every official he could name, though most were never answered. The rezoning had been finalized months ago, and sessions not open to the public. By the time he discovered the truth, it was already too late. Anonymous black SUVs began appearing on the gravel road that bordered his property. Sometimes they parked for hours, engines idling. No one emerged. No words were exchanged. Just presence, silent and watchful. Once, a drone hovered for nearly 10 minutes over his barn. He stood below it with his hat clenched in one hand, defiant, bewildered, and utterly alone. Ted's credit was frozen without explanation. A call to the bank led nowhere. The clerk sounded nervous, read from a script, and refused to elaborate. When he went to City Hall to demand answers, a clerk apologized and said the office was short-staffed, and someone would call him next week. The call never came. And so, that morning, with the frost still hugging the valley's edge and his breath steaming like a coal train, he stood in the shadow of the machines. There was no media. No crowds. No one to bear witness to what was being lost. Only the land, and the low thrum of engines warming up, and a final notice zip-tied to his gate: 5 days. The words were simple. Vacate or be removed. Ted read them 3 times, but he already knew them by heart. He walked the property that day as he had walked it every day for 4 decades. Touched the fence posts. Ran his hand across the old barn door where his wife once nailed sunflowers in summer. Sat beneath the oak. He didn't cry. He didn't speak. But he sat there a long while, until the sun was high and the shadow of the machines reached deeper into the field like fingers preparing to uproot everything that had ever grown. When night finally came, he lit the porch light not to welcome anyone, but to remind himself that this was still his home. For 5 more days. The soil on Ted Hudson's land was not rich, not the kind that appeared in agricultural magazines or yielded state fair trophies. It was stubborn earth, clay-heavy in some places, brittle in others, but it was honest. Everything he had ever loved or lost had been folded into that soil over the years like seeds left behind for memory to harvest. To others, the 88 acres meant nothing more than coordinates and assessments. But to Ted, it was where his life unfolded in chapters only he could read. It was where he had buried the family dog beneath a pecan tree during a summer storm in '93. Where he taught Daniel how to mend a broken fence post. Where his wife, Ellen, used to hang laundry on spring mornings, singing softly under her breath with clothespins clenched between her teeth. The land was not beautiful by design, but by attachment. Every stump and rut carried a story. In the western field stood the remains of a cattle shed. It had collapsed during an ice storm a few years after Ellen passed, and Ted never rebuilt it. Not out of neglect, but out of reverence. That shed was where he had once pulled a newborn calf from a breech birth, soaked in blood and straw, saving the life of both the calf and its mother. The memory clung to him like a warmth he hadn't felt in years. When he passed the ruin now, he did not look away or mourn. It simply reminded him of the time when his hands could still shape the future. Ted had kept records, receipts from tractor repairs, birth certificates of foals born in spring, a ledger dating back to 1972. In a drawer beside his bed was a letter from his wife, written the day before her first chemotherapy session. The ink had faded, but her handwriting, delicate and sure, was something he still traced with his fingers when the nights were long and the loneliness heavier than sleep. After the loss of Ellen, he had poured himself into the land with a devotion that often bordered on penance. There were no vacations, no weekend drives, no holidays spent away from the farm. Even the rare guests he received, an old friend from church, a cousin passing through, never stayed long. The silence of the valley had a weight to it, and it pressed hard on anyone not accustomed to its language. Daniel had understood it once. As a boy, he would walk the rows beside Ted in early summer, their boots lifting red dust with every step. But war had called, and Daniel had gone willingly, determined to prove something, to the world, to himself, perhaps to the father who never said much but always listened. When the flag-draped box arrived, the air in the house changed. It wasn't grief that consumed Ted, it was the way time itself seemed to stop. He refused military honors. Refused the procession. Instead, he built a bench near the oak tree and placed Daniel's boots beneath it. On the first Sunday of each month, he polished them, even now. Not out of ritual, but respect. That bench was the last thing he repaired with his own hands. He knew the developers didn't see any of this. They saw acreage, logistics potential, flat land with highway access. Their presentation at the town hall had been slick, PowerPoint slides, economic projections, smiling men in suits who'd never wiped sweat from their brows on a July afternoon. They called it progress. They said jobs. They promised growth. Ted had sat in the back row, hat in hand, surrounded by people he barely recognized anymore. Most of the old names had vanished. The council didn't call on him. The vote passed in under 7 minutes. He hired a lawyer the next morning, a wiry man from Little Rock who charged by the hour and spoke in cautious phrases. For 3 weeks they chased dead ends. The zoning permits had been filed quietly, the public notices buried in obscure sections of the paper. The county planning office returned calls late or not at all. Then one day, the lawyer's tone changed. A long pause on the phone, a muttered apology, and the words, "There's nothing more I can do." Ted thanked him anyway. Shortly after, his bank card was declined for groceries. When he called to ask why, he was told there had been a flag on his account. No one could explain it clearly. A supervisor would call him back. They never did. He started using cash, withdrawing what little was left in small bills, keeping it in a mason jar under the sink. He bought fewer groceries. Watered down milk. Drove only when necessary. The SUVs showed up after that, always black, always idling. No plates on some. Tinted windows. Once, someone in a suit stepped out and took photos of the barn. No words were exchanged. Just a nod, and then gone. The final notice came with the morning frost. It was zip-tied to the gate, laminated and weighted to withstand the wind. A courier must have delivered it, because the mailbox was empty. 5 days. The ink was sharp and impersonal. Ted stared at it for a long time. Then, almost instinctively, he went inside and retrieved the folded flag from Daniel's service. He placed it gently on the kitchen table. Then he opened the bottom drawer of the old roll-top desk, pulled out his wife's last letter, and placed it beside the flag. That night, he made a pot of coffee though he wasn't hungry. He sat on the porch with the thermos in one hand and the sh*tg*n resting beside the swing, not in threat, but in mourning. His hand ran slowly along the wooden armrest where Ellen used to sit. The night was quiet. The porch light buzzed faintly. He thought about leaving. Thought about walking away, letting the machines take it all. But every time he imagined that, the land grew darker in his mind. A patch of pavement where the oak once stood. A loading dock where the cattle used to drink. Steel panels over Daniel's boots. He couldn't do it. He wouldn't. The court order arrived like the breaking of a fever, abrupt, unexpected, and followed by silence that didn't yet feel real. It was printed on plain white paper, stamped in blue ink, and signed by a federal judge whose name Ted didn't recognize. But its message was clear: all development on the Hudson property was to cease immediately. The word injunction repeated 5 times in the first 2 paragraphs. The corporation's permit had been revoked. The rezoning declared void. Any attempts to remove Ted or alter the property would be considered criminal trespass. The earth, for once, was still. Within hours of the convoy's arrival and the exposure of the forged documents, the story spread faster than roots through floodplain. Reporters from state outlets swarmed Baker County. Cameras stood where corn once grew. For years, no one had spoken Ted's name beyond a passing wave in the hardware store. Now it echoed through microphones and news feeds. The corporation's name was now tied to corruption. State investigators arrested the county planning director within 48 hours. 2 city council members were photographed being escorted from their homes in handcuffs. The mayor released a statement full of apologies and excuses, but no one paid it much attention. Public trust had turned like a sudden frost, *ling the last green leaf of authority that once protected them. Ted watched it unfold quietly. He never raised his voice. Never gave interviews. When reporters asked for comment, he simply said he had work to do. There were fences to mend, after all. Equipment to service. Seeds to plant. The ground had waited long enough. 2 months later, the field began to bloom again. It was spring. The light returned to the valley with the gentleness of forgiveness. Rain came steady, not cruel. Birds nested in the eaves of the barn, which now bore a fresh coat of red paint. The bench near the oak tree had been repaired. Daniel's boots, still resting beneath it, were polished and dry. The convoy had left, but their presence lingered in a different way. Major Hargreaves returned once more, not in uniform this time, but in work clothes. He brought with him a group of veterans who volunteered to help restore what had been damaged. They rebuilt the cattle shed, replanted native flowers, repaired irrigation. Ted didn't ask for it. He didn't need to. These men had served together, bled together, buried brothers together. No words were needed between them. They understood silence. One morning, while unloading hay near the front gate, Ted noticed something new. A wooden sign, freshly staked into the ground where the machines once stood. Burned into its surface were the words, "Hudson Farm, protected ground." Here, a man stood, and the people stood with him. No fanfare. No ceremony. Just a symbol, like a gravestone for the battle that nearly erased everything. Neighbors who had once avoided him began to stop by. They brought baked goods, offers to help, tools they had no use for anymore. The local feed store announced a Hudson discount for veterans and heritage farmers. Even school children began arriving on field trips, walking respectfully along the narrow dirt path near the oak, pausing by the boots, the cross, the old bench. No one touched anything. They simply looked. And learned. The diner in town, once cold to his presence, now displayed a framed photo of the farm beside the register. A quote beneath it read, "When one man stands for right, he invites others to rise." Ted never asked who put it there. He didn't need to. In the weeks that followed, a small nonprofit formed, Heritage Grounds, with support from veterans, farmers, and pro bono attorneys. Its mission was simple: to identify and protect historic family-owned farms from unlawful seizure. Ted declined a leadership role, but his name remained at the top of the letterhead. The first meeting was held beneath the oak tree, folding chairs and thermoses circling the bench like campfires of old. For the first time in years, Ted's porch no longer felt like a retreat. It felt like a post. A place to watch the road, to see who came next, to welcome them not with suspicion but with strength. The land had survived, not because it was strong, but because someone chose to love it when it would have been easier to leave. The machines had gone. The black SUVs never returned. The scar on the field healed faster than anyone expected. In its place grew sunflowers, rows planted by hand, just as Ellen had once imagined they would. Sometimes, Ted sat on the bench and listened. To the wind. To the quiet. To the soil. And in those moments, he understood that legacy wasn't a thing of wealth or power. It wasn't measured in yield or market value. It lived in the choices made when no one is watching. It grew where men sowed dignity without promise of reward. The porch light still burned each night. Not in fear. Not in warning. But in witness. And in the valley, where silence once stood as defeat, it now stood as honor. Kindness without question is enough.